much for coming. Switching to another language. I'm happy that I cannot speak Chinese, otherwise it would be more complicated. Well, my name is Edgar Göll. I'm a sociologist by education. I'm working as a future researcher at the IZT, the Institute for Future Studies and Technology Assessment here in Berlin, since '95, last century. I'm also teaching at the Free University at the master's program, Future Research, and many of the students are here, I think. Thank you for coming. And today we will talk about a topic I think everybody here in the room is very excited about and very concerned about. And before I introduce the three speakers and let them present their input, I will tell you a little story. Because several weeks ago I read a new scientific or a science fiction book by Stanley Robinson, The Ministry for the Future. And there's a story built, a very complicated story about the future, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, and it's about climate change and how it might become possible to reduce the climate heating and so forth. It starts in India. A heating catastrophe happens. Many people are starving and are killed by this heat. And then the story goes on to explain how some people or some countries are reacting. And there's a researcher who is one of the major figures. He's moving to Geneva in Switzerland, contacting civil people. And then there's another person, a woman, who will become the minister of the Ministry for the Future. And then there are some other storylines, of course. And what I found very interesting is that Kim Robinson presents us a whole spectrum of different kinds of responses to this catastrophe of the heated atmosphere. The one extreme would be the ministry. Another extreme would be the scientists who come up with many different solutions. And an extreme other solution, so to say, is terrorism. And terrorism means, in that case, that ships who are coming from Singapore or whatever to Europe and so forth, they get destroyed by drones, by some terrorist group. He doesn't explain it further, but I think it's insofar interesting. If you go back to in the history, you will see that very often these extreme forms are a response of different huge and catastrophic problems. So I don't want to say that this will happen, but it could be happening. And these terrorist attacks are attacks against corporations, against the shipbuilding industry, against atomic industry, and the basic industries. So this is important to have in mind and to remember if we talk about the future, that this could happen. And today we talk about sustainability, but not about the whole approach, the whole leitmotif, but rather about a sector, and this is the business sector in a more complex form. And therefore we have invited three experts to present their papers here on specific issues concerning the future of sustainable economics, if you like, and very specifically about corporations, about firms, how they can react and improve their sustainable approach and their sustainable practice. So, in the field of future research and specifically in the field of sustainable development research, we came up with a motto which is saying either we will have a transformation, a change of our societies which is causing disaster, or we will have a change in our society which will be done by design or by conscious politics. So the alternative is transformation by disaster or transformation by design. And I say this in the beginning because if I think in 10, 20, 30 years from now, we will have much, much more trouble concerning climate change, social problems, polarization, maybe civil wars and whatsoever. So we have to kind of prepare our thinking in this kind of area. So I have told you, and you have seen it in the program, that we will have 3 presentations today. Each of these presentations comes from a different direction, from a different person, of course. And I will introduce for the first presentation, and this is Dr. Karina Vissonova. She's not here in present, but she's here by high-tech possibilities. She is over here. She can hear us, it seems, and we can hear her. We have tested this. And her approach is to understand or try to understand how design thinking can help us to understand better the future material well-being in this age of climate change, and what it requires for business community to advance sustainability with kind of design thinking. I think this is the short story of her presentation. So, and Karina has founded an Institute of Advanced Design Studies. That's her background, and that's why she is focusing her talk about design and the idea how business can use design thinking and sustainability in order to advance their business and improve their overall situation. So I invite you, Karina, to start your presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. You can hear me well? Yes, okay. I'll just continue then. Well, thank you for inviting me and thank you for the introduction. Edgar, I'm very sorry not to be there in person, of course. Just to recap how I see what my presentation will be about. So my brief talk will be about the future of well-being in a scenario of limited production consumption imposed by conditions necessary to achieve sustainability, which I believe is a possible future scenario if we are to overcome the climate crisis. I will be talking from a design perspective, or more precisely from a perspective of philosophy of design, because that is my background. The thoughts I will be sharing with you are from my preliminary research on the subject, and hence please excuse if some of the thoughts appear yet somewhat incomplete. Could we have next slide, please? How do we perceive well-being? A generally upheld truth is in our contemporary society is that human well-being constitutes a state of healthy, happy, and prosperous selves, and that this condition is validated by an access to material goods. Well-being to us means an individual autonomy. This is a thought I borrow from Axel Honneth. We experience it as a freedom to independently pursue individual interests and to satisfy subjectively determined needs, resulting in the above-mentioned state of being. Next slide, please. Before the era of industrialization, goods were made to order by craftsmen or inherited and traded thereon. Industrialization brought the possibilities of more people having access to more goods and a range of goods meeting various needs, desires, and preferences. The collective well-being is increased, while it comes as a consequence of the industrialization, that we interpret an increased access to larger number of goods, constituting an increase of material well-being of individuals and nations. More importantly, because we have bridged the state of well-being with the state of personal autonomy, we are motivated to secure sufficient means that establish an independence from others. And so the Westernized societies appear to be constructed on equal distribution of goods that enable each one of us to independently pursue autonomy. An equal distribution of such goods is therefore equated with justice. In our intent to pursue autonomy, we have formed a society where accessing materialistic values is an encouraged behavior and it supports social justice. Could we have next slide, please? In contrast, societies with weaker contribution of goods for enabling personal autonomy are perceived to have relatively low conditions for well-being and perhaps even being as unjust. And next slide. I argue that the age of climate change and our pursuits for a more sustainable society, the perception of well-being is likely to change. Next slide, please. The idea of sustainability is disruptive to our current conception of well-being. The desirable conditions for a just future require a transformation in our society that imposes certain limits to how we design, produce, and use our goods, how we design our buildings, and how we commute or travel. And let me tell you what I find fascinating about the transformation sparked by the idea of sustainability. Unlike the typical shifts of industries and policies that are caused by technological innovations or scientific discoveries, the changes we are undergoing in the name of sustainability are caused by a change of values. We no longer tolerate goods that cause pollution and extraction of resources. We are valuing different relationships with things, and we are conscious of buying less. I believe the strongest comparison to another value-based transformation of society is the abolishment of slavery. It spoke against economic benefits, but it was the right and the moral thing to do. Sustainability is a value we must and we do collectively strive to uphold, just as we strive to uphold values like freedom and peace. Maybe one day we will look back on the heavily industrialized societies the same way as we look at slavery. The illustration you're looking at is the 2005 mapping of sustainable development, which I believe was one of the first maps of sustainability initiatives and movements, and which illustrated how complex and paradoxical the notion of sustainability is. The paradoxes are multi-layered, and as I expect most of you in the audience are familiar with these, we will not go any deeper here. What we may want to remember from this illustration is the wide range of notions for equalizing social justice and environmental protection, and how far some of these are apart. The value of sustainability to some of us means a better use of natural resources, while the others, utility of resources, is irrelevant, as nature has value beyond us, humans, and our existence. Next slide, please. To follow through to my argument, I want to bring your attention from the map to the three levels of advancement of sustainability movements. So these are the status quo, the reform, and the transformation. In the next slides, I will be reflecting on the currently popularly narrated green growth or the reform approach. Next slide, please. The greening of the production consumption model is the most widely narrated approach, and I'm primarily referring to the EU here. It seeks to equally secure social justice and environmental protection. I think it makes sense to dissect this approach into two branches. The first is to decouple growth based on industrial production from environmental pressures, for instance, by applying circular economy principles, and thus to make the goods and their entire journeys more sustainable. The second branch is to motivate consumers to buy these green products. Next slide, please. I find that this approach maintains the image of the world as a market, and this image is perhaps not the best for designing more sustainably, nor for more adequate material well-being. The first challenge is that, according to the European Environmental Bureau report 2019, there's no evidence of successful industry cases of actual decoupling from environmental pressures. The speed at which we are shifting to more sustainable practices has not measured up to the speed the crisis has grown. Next slide, please. Sorry, I have flies in my room, sorry. Allow me to quote from the Environmental Bureau report. The validity of the green growth discourse relies on the assumption of an absolute, permanent, global, large, and fast enough decoupling of economic growth from all critical environmental pressures. The literature reviewed clearly shows that there is no empirical evidence of such decoupling currently happening. This is the case for materials, energy, water, greenhouse gases, land, water pollutants, and biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Those familiar with the large manufacturing businesses will recognize how taxing is a change in these type of organizations, how costly it is to shift out machinery to newer, more efficient and environmentally friendly machines, to change infrastructure, meanwhile meeting new quality standards of products now sensitized to the environment. Thus, concerning the approach with the green production and accumulated good solutions is showing to be too ineffective, too costly, and too slow for meeting the climate goals. To expect a drastic change towards more sustainable society while employing the same thinking as in the age of industrialization seems now a fading and misplaced prospect. Next slide, please. The challenge with the green consumption is that we are literally asking the members of society to purchase sustainability by appealing to our materialistic values, when in fact sustainability-oriented behavior is motivated by intrinsic values. According to research by the Common Cause Foundation, people are more inclined to believe in a strong presence of materialistic values of others. That is, we tend to say that we are more ready to change our behavior, to buy less, etc., but our in-laws, our neighbors, and so on are not. And so intrinsic values, it appears, are more prevalent in our society than we perceive. Next slide, please. Furthermore, I argue that consumption is a pattern that is a legacy of the industrialization. While yes, we do practice something we could call a necessary consumption and arbitrary consumption, vital levels are fairly satisfied, and the ongoing overconsumption is more of a habitual or psychological act, which we may begin to recognize as an embedded element of a so constructed society. Next slide, please. Thus, concerning the approach with the green consumption, the appeal to materialistic values is misplaced and creates further obstacles to introducing social behavior change at the scale needed to obtain conditions for sustainable society. Next slide, please. Moreover, concerning value perception, we tend to think that the value of goods and services is placed with consumers. I believe this is a very early industrial thinking of value of goods and is rather inaccurate today. Try to imagine an automotive industry or fashion and textile industry without it bringing a value to the providers of these goods. A product cannot be realized that is manufactured and distributed if it does not firstly create value for its provider. Next slide, please. Material well-being is interpreted as affluence, but well-being is not an antonym to poverty nor subjective physical discomfort. Well-being is denied when human rights for subjective self-preservation are denied, which again does not concern merely pursuit of autonomy in a system of just distribution of goods, but here refers to rights of future balanced with ecological limits. I believe that the rules made the industry-based development the success for contemporary societies no longer apply. A pure production consumption-based society model is a heritage of the past era, and it does not serve well the society in the age of climate change. Next slide, please. If the greening of the production consumption model is not proving to be an adequate strategy for attaining sustainable society, the alternative and much less discussed approach is to lower the economic ambitions, lower global production, and establish a model that accommodates sufficiency. This is an approach that is advocated by the Environmental Bureau. I quote, "Existing policy strategies aiming to increase efficiency have to be complemented by the pursuit of sufficiency. That is the direct downscaling of economic production in many sectors and parallel reduction of consumption that together will enable the good life within the planet's ecological limits." End of quote. And so sufficiency is likely a scenario that will reshape our society. To paint a picture how this might look like, I here have mind mapped some possible identifiers for conditions of sufficiency. So decency and equality in distribution of goods and services meeting vital levels. So note that I'm not referring to a just distribution of goods for an attainment of personal autonomy. Next is emerging economic systems, and those emerging manufacturing techniques, and excuse me, formatting new social transaction schemes, which may lead to ideas of virtual or artificial lifestyles and ideas for substitutions of experiences with products and services. For instance, in the last few years, I see an increase of game apps where you can decorate interiors or play dress up or similar. These are games that substitute the exercising of our inherent creativity from real time to a virtual experience. Next point is much needed new design thinking. Design must take into account the values prevailing in society and be in service to these values. And last point I wish to mention in the identifiers of conditions for sufficiency is the future of policy for reduced liberties for the benefit of future generations. Next slide, please. Now, having all of the above in mind, I'm steering you to imagine how to design for the material well-being in age of transformative sufficiency, a term I use here to cover for the possible scenario of reduced industrial activities for the sake of future. As design is in service to economic relations, to understand foundations for designing, we must understand the foundations for forming economic relations. We would have to consider collective and individual perspectives in which examples of the collective foundations could be a peaceful coexistence, happiness for the majority, and public wealth. And the individual foundations could be self-interests, rights to ownership, freedom, self-preservation, and self-actualization. Next slide, please. To form a new conception of material well-being that is relevant in the transformative age of climate change, I propose the following preliminary considerations. First consideration is towards the vital levels of well-being, which include enabled social contribution and responsibility, subjective tendency for self-preservation and growth, which leads to an individual right to a future, and experiencing immaterial well-being, I mean beyond the boundaries of reality, which I believe we can possibly call here consciousness. Note that experiencing immaterial well-being requires all vital levels to be satisfied, subjective to individual requirements, of course. I would like to quote Hovel with regards to the point above. Even basic needs can never be satisfied as ends in themselves, but as means to the realization of a person. Second consideration is an aspect of human ambition to accumulate wealth, currently nurtured by the production consumption model, versus human aspiration to have good life in a coherent society. And the next concept in conceptualizing material well-being is a consideration towards a transcendence of vital levels, which corresponds to satisfying desires and impulses in the context of individual and collective rights and environmental capacities. Next slide, please. And so I started with the basic understanding we have today of well-being, and that is a state of healthy, happy, and prosperous selves. Yet we have a new context, a new potential scenario for which we are poorly, if at all, conceptually and practically equipped. And that is the scenario of an alternative society model characterized by sufficiency. This new scenario, the way I see it, presents us with an opportunity to elevate our material well-being to a state where all three following conditions are satisfied. Vital levels of well-being that embody subjective self-preservation, self-actualization, both ensuring the individual's rights to a future, experiencing consciousness, and enabled responsibility and contribution to a society. Arbitrary needs, which embody desires and satisfying impulses in the context of individual and collective rights, and within the limits of economic and moral capacities to satisfy them. And finally, the collective needs, which embody belonging to community, healthy and balanced locality, as well as collective rights to futures. Before I move on to my preliminary definition of material well-being, let me squeeze in two rather accurate and valuable quotes from his meaning. The concept of needs is always relative to the valuation of the person, who is constantly changing and evolving as time goes by and different circumstances emerge, just like his or her needs. And the problem is not the complexity and spring of new needs, but rather their quality and their relationship to parallel evolution of moral and economic capacities to satisfy them. Next slide, please. This being so, I envision that the future material well-being is in the transformative age of climate change is less materialistic and perhaps even more precisely less material. It may be defined as connected individual needs of self-preservation and self-actualization, a right to exercise creativity and to experience freedom within the limits imposed by sustainability values, with the collective needs which provide rights to futures equal to all, and I mean human or other living beings. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. I now formulate some of the points made through my talk as a list of actions to resolve or points to pay attention to going forward and designing for the future well-being. We must support the enhancement of community and locality value and to design for the evolving collective needs of communities and localities. We must design for the liberty to experience human consciousness, as in aspiring to things outside the confines of reality. I'm quoting Rosmini here. We ought to place the value of goods and services proportionally onto producers and consumers. That means that we have outlived the formula declaring that production exists because of the needs of the consumers. We should explore creativity via virtual or artificial life experience, liberty to create without the use of resources. I think of it as an elaborate prototyping exercise until the ultimate solution is reached, replacing the minimal viable product approach and the iterative design approach we widely have in circulation today. Design must employ transdisciplinarity in solutions of tomorrow, as that is the key to discoveries beyond the limitations of the current solutions. And the changes of policies and politics will influence design, possibly elevating even more the importance of social design and digital design, also social innovation. And design must obtain an understanding of the implications of the future of economic freedom. And design must develop thought methods that assess emerging and future challenges, as perhaps to an extent, it has lingered in the role of a crisis respondent in the context of climate change. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank
Is
you very
anybody
much.
There?
Yes, yes, yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karina. This has very much to do with a very complicated goal to change the culture of our societies, it seems. So, well, but first of all, I would like to open the floor for questions specifically to your conclusion and your ideas about these changes. Are there any questions? At least I have one. If we look at these conclusions here, that material well-being and how to design for it, the question comes up to my mind, the tension between individual choice starting from today and thinking about individual choices in the future. You see, I think that today's, the power of a presence is so powerful because it includes all our senses. And to think about our future well-being, it needs just your brain, and it's abstract. So do you have any ideas from your own experience, from your thinking, how this can be overcome? Would be, for instance, a very good scenario, one tool to overcome this gap between today's well-being, today's situation of human beings and the future human being situation. What do you think?
Thank you for the question. I actually feel, and part of the point of my research was that we are literally going to end up in a situation where our lives will change, and it will be up to us, a little bit like what you started with today when you introduced the panel today, that our lives will change, and how we cope with it. What is the decision with approaching the tomorrow, basically, and I'm a strong believer that yes, we can change. I mean, I've changed my life tremendously according to the principles that I'm talking about here. But it's not, it is of course about personal choice, but it's not the personal choice in, let's say, family settings. I think it's the personal choice in business settings. So the decisions we make in order to progress in a career or in order to progress as a society, these are two currently opposing decisions. Which bring that tension that you were saying before. I look at it more from that perspective. I'm not sure if that sufficiently answers your question, but that's my train of thought anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And of course, I understand that you focus your thinking on the business side, on the corporation, and on the question of consumption and production, on this tension which is existing there, I think. And the question, but again, would be, how are the business people motivated, or how can you motivate them to change their way of doing business, their way of production, and their way of producing products which are, as you say, are more, well, maybe have a higher quality, and so forth and so forth. Is there, what would you say about this?
We have, I mean, my background, professional background before I founded my institute is in product development. I worked for a large company and I was in innovation team. We were looking for new product concepts, and I was very much focusing on always going only the sustainable product, or the green way. And I know from my experience that to introduce a product that would be truly sustainable and would be truly needed in society, not just for the manufacturer's sake, but also for the society's sake, those products usually do not meet the manufacturing techniques that we have in place most of the time today, nor do they meet actually the quality standards we have in place today. So even if we want to, and this is one of the points I was also trying to make during the presentation. I know there was a lot of thoughts in there, but one of the ideas I wanted to say that it's not because we don't want to change. We want to change, but we are somewhat stuck is not a good word, but for the lack of the better word right now, we are stuck somewhat in what we are doing. It's like being in inertia. We're just going forward because that's our I wouldn't say it's our culture, but it's the way we have set our society, and our behavior is thus because the society is thus.
Okay, I think you are talking about routines, daily routines, and even the culture we are in and we are part of. And it's, I think, the big challenge for each of us individually or for individual firms to change step by step and come to another kind of development. But for me personally, it seems that the time is pressing, so we have to think if there are other methods. You are mentioning policies and politics and other ways of changing, which all of them have to come together, I think, in order to get us going in this direction, it seems to me. Okay, so I have another question. Du bist dran. I think you... Okay. Ja. Weil sonst hätten wir noch Ludwig W.
Yeah, hello, thanks for the talk. As I understand it, you do this type of design-based research or design-based consulting to companies with your institute. Could you maybe specify that?
We do research in design education for sustainability, and we run courses in parallel in transdisciplinary education for sustainability.
So would you frame this as transformative or transdisciplinary, or do you have a framework that you use for this?
Would we train, sorry?
Do you frame this type of research you're doing or education you're doing as transformative or as transdisciplinary, or how would you frame this?
I actually, now you put those two words, two terms on it, I would say it's both. We are aiming to advance the way we think when we approach design, and we absolutely must use transdisciplinarity when we design for or when we actually learn how to design for future. So there is no way around that.
Yeah, and on the slide we're seeing there's this word value replacement. Do you use specific value systems, or how do you frame value in your work? How do you communicate values, or how do you assess value change?
the specific reference to values in this presentation and in this preliminary research here is from the Common Cause Foundation. You can check their website. It's from UK, foundation from UK, and they've done an amazing job in understanding what values actually in reality drive our cultures. And this is from them I learned. I made the interview with them, and there's also a fantastic report available at WWF UK from 2008. If you send me your email, I could send you a reference. Anyhow, they use the basic sort of distinction of values. There's sort of more materialistic values, which would be, you know, like serving self-interest, buying a new car and what have you. And then there's the intrinsic values, which are serving the interests of your survival within a community, your survival within the nature environment on this earth. I mean, these are very sort of shortened versions, but yeah, this is the perspective I've been using so far, my thinking.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Okay.
welcome.